So let's start off talking about what I consider to be the finest strategist that ever lived. And he was a man who started off as a manager, if you like, a junior manager in a large organization, and he worked his way up, and his name was Alex. Alex's father was the head of the organization, and Alex admired his father, learned a lot from his father, studied hard when he was growing up, but he had great dreams and aspirations of building a big organization far bigger than that of his father's. Now, the Alex that I'm talking about was Alexander of Macedon, who became known as Alexander the Great, one of the first and few men in all of human history to be called the Great in his lifetime and throughout the rest of the pages of history. Now, Alexander, when he was 19 years old, his father was killed probably by an enemy. He was killed with a spear through the eye, I believe it was, and Alexander immediately became the head of Macedon, and the Macedonians were a race or a tribe in northern Greece. They were very tough, very hardy, very militaristic race, and they had conquered and ruled all of Greece. Now, within Alexander's household, within his army and the army of his father, and within the other tribes of Greece, there were an enormous number of enemies, or if you like, market competitors for Alexander's position. So Alexander, as soon as he became the king at the age of 19, found that there were several armies being raised against him and several plots and conspiracies internally being raised to kill him, put him out of the way, and spring free, if you like, the city-states of Greece from Macedonian rule. Alexander immediately took command, as a leader does. He immediately put down the disloyal elements in his own army. He immediately put his army together with his own people in place and demolished the army sent against him and became the recognized and accepted master of all of Greece at the age of 19 and a half. Then he set off on his mission. Now, Alexander, like all strategic planners, had a mission, and his mission was to bring Greek culture, to bring, if you like, the control of the marketplace in the world to under Greek rule, that he wanted to bring Greek culture to all the areas of the world that he could reach. And the Delphic Oracle had told him at a very young age, when he was 15, that he could either have a long life full of peace or a short life full of glory. And he chose a short life full of glory. At the age of 19, he disembarked his father's armies, which are now his armies. He took 20,000 men, he put them on ships, he sailed across and began to fulfill his destiny to rule all the known world. He was told he could rule all the lands that he could look upon with his own eyes, he could be master of. And he began fighting in Asia Minor. Now, Asia Minor is what is called, was present-day Turkey. And as his armies moved through Asia Minor, they would run into other armies that were sent against them, and they defeated every single one. Alexander was a brilliant planner, and he had brilliant generals under him. His troops were extremely well trained, very well disciplined, and very tough. And he won every single battle. Now, in those days, when you fought with spears and swords, one did not fight and run away and live to fight another day. Fighting was rather final. And so therefore the soldiers of the armies in the path of Alexander's advance began to hear about what had happened to the previous armies, and they found that anybody who fought against Alexander lost. And if you lost with a spear through your chest, it would be enough to ruin your whole day. And so the word began to go out that perhaps it would be a good idea not to fight with Alexander. Now, Alexander was also very smart in that he did not disrupt the kingdoms that he took over. He left them under the rule of their own people. All he had them do is, if you like, pay a tribute to Greece, to pay taxes each year. And other than that, they could go on pretty much the same way that they were, only now they were under the protection of the Greek Empire, the protection of the Macedonians. Well, as he moved further south, more and more tribes came and joined him, gave up without a fight, decided not to go to battle with him, and joined his armies, and his armies moved south. Now, the big guy on the block, the head of the biggest empire in the world at this time, was a man named Darius of Persia. Darius had his capital in what is present-day Tehran, and Darius ruled the biggest empire the world had ever seen. His empire went from the Indus River in Pakistan all the way to the Mediterranean, all the way through picking away at the edges of his empire, and people were beginning to ask the question, I wonder who's the toughest, Alexander the Macedonian or Darius of Persia? Darius was a smart man, and he recognized that this was a threat. So he sent an army of 50,000 men against about 22,000 men of Alexander's. He sent the army out, he said, go and crush this upstart once and for all. Well, Alexander anticipating this, laid out his strategy and demolished and routed the army that was sent against him. Darius, upon hearing of what had happened, he said, "This is serious. This is the biggest single threat to my power, to my empire in my lifetime, and it must be dealt with, or there will be challenges to my strength and challenges to Persian rule all around the empire." So he sent out his messengers, and he sent the messengers out to different tribes throughout the empire, and he said, "Send me your best troops, and have your troops meet me at a place called Arbela." And he sent out levies to dozens of smaller kingdoms, and they sent thousands and thousands of troops to meet him at Arbela in Asia Minor to fight with Alexander. Well, this battle took place in 333 BC. Alexander acceded to the throne of Macedon in 336. 3 years later, he was 22 years old. He had approximately 50,000 men from the men who had joined him, and Darius now assembled his army at Arbela, actually outside Arbela at a place called Gaugamela. He assembled the biggest army that the world had ever seen. In all of history, up until World War II, there had never been an army this large assembled in one place. It is estimated by various historians, and there's something like 400 historical accounts of this battle, because it was one of the most important battles in human civilization. It literally was a pivotal battle in the history of the Western world. He assembled an army of 1 million men at Arbela. This army was an enormous army. They said it was so huge that at night the campfires spread east and west and over the horizon as far as the eye could see. It was like looking at a field of sparkling diamonds. There just seemed to be no end. It was almost like an ocean of fighting men. Now, Alexander was a little bit further south in Asia Minor, and when Darius had assembled his troops, he went out to a place called Gaugamela, 35 miles outside of Arbela, moved the entire army out there and cleared the ground, smoothed off the entire ground. Cleared the ground so that the ground would be clear for his troops and for his chariots, the major battle force that he had. And then he sent a messenger to Alexander, and he said, "Alexander," he said, "you're so tough." He said, "Why don't you come to Gaugamela and let's fight. Let's see who's the toughest." Alexander immediately broke camp. They thought it would take Alexander 7 days to get there. He was there within 48 hours. His camp was 50,000 men. He settled his camp in, put out his guards, and everybody knew that the next day they would be fighting one of the greatest battles in history. Alexander had 50,000 men. Darius had 1 million. That night, Alexander's commanders came around him. Alexander always told his people everything they needed to know. Alexander was quoted as saying, "It is not necessary that our generals know what the plan of battle is, but it's essential that the men who must fight it know what the plan of battle is." But he called his generals together and he sat them down. His general said, "Sire, what do you think is going to happen tomorrow?" And he said, "Well," he said, "we're going to win." They said, "Well, sire," he said, "the men have all great faith and trust in you, but you realize that the odds are kind of bad here. I mean, there's 20 to 1 odds according to our very best intelligence sources. We have faith in you, but this is an awful lot." He said, "Yes," he said, "but you mustn't worry." He said, "Well, what gives us cause not to worry?" He said, "Well, I have a plan." He said, "Sir, that's good." He said, "That's very good, sir. We're glad to hear that you have a plan. Could you please tell us what it is?" And he said, "Yes, I'll tell you what it is." He said, "I've thought this through very carefully." He said, "And of course, it's not possible for us with 50,000 men to defeat an army of 1 million. However, I believe that the army of Darius is not really one army, but it's a whole series of armies, something like 30 different armies made up of troops and levies from all over the empire, and that these armies have nothing really in common with each other except a common loyalty to Darius. They have different languages, different cultures, different orders of battle, different religious rites, different military organization, and so on. The only thing they have in common is a loyalty to Darius." And he said, "And I believe that if something were to happen to Darius tomorrow, that the rest of the armies would split, that they would take off rather than stay and continue the fight." Now, Darius has his camp right here in the front of the army where he's going to direct this battle. They all expect this battle to be over by lunchtime. They expect it to be a crushing defeat. So I want you to go back and I want you to tell all the men in my army that we don't have to worry about defeating this whole army because we're not going to fight the whole army. He said, "Tomorrow we're going to do one thing." He said, "We're going to go out and we're going to kill Darius." Do you understand that? Tell them we're going to kill Darius. And the word went down to the Macedonian army at night, passed on from man to man. The order of battle for the next day would be to kill Darius. The next day they lined up the troops. Darius lined up his army like a massive wall of humanity, of 1 million men, to move forward and simply crush and overwhelm the Macedonian army of 50,000. But Alexander lined up his army a little bit differently. He lined up his army the next morning in ranks like this, a strategy that, to the best of my knowledge in studying military strategy, has never been used before or since. He lined up his armies deep, and Darius, historical accounts say, well, what on earth is he doing? He said, well, sire, this is a very unconventional way of organizing his troops. Now, Darius's major attack force were battle chariots. Now, battle chariots were the chariots that have the hooked swords that come out from the wheels, and they would cut through, and those swords would spin razor sharp, and they would cut the legs and arms, literally chop the troops into hamburgers they went through them. And if you sent 300 battle chariots against an opposing force and they went through with arms and legs flying in all directions, it went a long way toward demoralizing the fighting ability of the opposing force. And it had worked for Darius for years, and Alexander knew this would be his strategy. The reason Darius had chosen this ground was because he could flatten the ground, and the ground would be flat like a massive parking lot so his chariots could maneuver. So Alexander lined up his men like this, and just before the battle began, he began to move his army this way. Now, there was rough country over here, country that Alexander would have a small advantage in, and as he began to move his army sideways, the entire army moved sideways, kaboom. This is what is known as maneuver or surprise. They began to move sideways. And Darius said to his men, what on earth is he doing? They say, well, he's moving sideways off the battlefield, sire. They said, well, move our army sideways too. So they tried to move this army sideways, and it created a little bit of chaos and confusion in the army. Finally, Darius said, the heck with this. He said, send in the chariots. And they sent in the chariots. And the chariots attacked, all ready to go. And they attacked at this wall of troops. And at the critical moment, Alexander had all of his men turn with their shields sideways and their spears out from the shields and dig into the ground, with the spears in the ground and the shields in front. Now, what the horses saw was a wall of shields, just simply like a wooden wall, and bristling with spears. Now, men will charge walls bristling with spears, but horses are smarter than that. And the horses and the chariots began to turn, and as they turned, they began to trip each other up, and they became more and more confused, and they went back into the back here. They went right around the army, and in the back, Alexander's men were waiting with spears and swords to pick them up, and archers, and tear them to pieces. And the whole charge was demolished. At this point, Darius said, this is ridiculous. What on earth is going on over there? There was some confusion. They were getting different signals. Have they broken through? Is it time to advance? And Alexander saw his moment. His critical moment was now, and he said, and Alexander was right here. He always led his troops. He was always the very forefront of his troops. He believed that he could not be killed, and so he always was in front. He wore white armor. He had a white plume, rode a huge black horse, and if you wanted to know where the battle was, where the man on the black horse was, it was always where Alexander was. And he said to his men, what he's called his companion cavalry, 6,000 veteran cavalry, heavy cavalry, he said, follow me, let's go kill Darius. And he threw his army with himself at the beginning like a spear into the center of the Persian army, just like a spear, and he said, follow me, and they charged and went straight for Darius. Now, of course, Darius had never anticipated that something like this would happen. He said, what on earth is going on? They said, well, he's coming right for you, sir. He said, well, stop him. They said, well, sir, we're trying to stop him, but we hadn't anticipated that he would actually initiate an attack or an offensive attack against our forces. Now, this is a brilliant attack, by the way, brilliant strategy, because in this sort of strategy, the only part of Darius's army, the whole Persian army that could fight against Alexander, was this part here, was the part that is directly facing Alexander. All the rest of the army was useless because there was no one for them to fight against. And not only that, Darius could not be giving commands to the rest of the army to move forward as long as he was facing a direct assault on his own encampment. So Darius said, stop him quickly. They said, we're doing everything we possibly can, sire, but he just continues to advance. They said, well, if you don't stop him, he said, he's going to break through. He says, yes, sire, that's a very great possibility. And Alexander's men kept cutting through. Alexander's men, none of the Persians had expected this kind of an assault. And Darius finally said, well, he said, if this is the way it's going to be, he said, I think I'll go back to the palace for lunch, and you guys can stay here and fight with them. And he jumped in his chariot with his battle flags waving, and he drove off the field of battle. Now, around him were his vice presidents, if you like, his generals, and they said, well, sire, we don't want you to do lunch alone. We'll come with you. And they jumped into their chariots, and they got the hell out, too. Now, the rest of these armies didn't know what was going on. There was dust and confusion and shouting and trumpets and these sounds of horses and men dying. It was terrible sounds. But they did know one thing. They got through the grapevine. They heard that Darius was fleeing. Now these guys were not very smart, as they say. They weren't Rhodes Scholars or Oxford Scholars. They were pretty humble, simple, solid fighting guys, but they could add 2 plus 2. Now the first 2 was that from everything they'd heard about Alexander, he never lost a battle, and anybody that fought against Alexander lost. And it was a terrible way to end your day. He said number 2 is that Darius is fleeing the scene of battle. Alexander never loses, Darius is fleeing. What could that possibly add up to? It could add up to that, believe it or not, we must have lost. If we have lost, then we had better get the heck out of here, because those Macedonians are mean SOBs. And the word went out that Alexander has won, Darius has fled, let's get out, and they all took off. His strategy was correct. The armies took off. They fell over each other. They stumbled. Horses and men broke their legs. And then Alexander, who had anticipated this, began the advance. And his advance went straight through this army like a haymaking machine. At the end of the day, the Persians had lost 400,000 dead. It was one of the most incredible and disastrous battles in all of human history. The Macedonians under Alexander lost 1,247 men, and Alexander at the age of 22 was the undisputed master of the entire world. Why do I tell you this story? Well, this is one of the greatest examples of good strategy that you'll ever see in your entire life, and I'm going to link in some of these principles as we talk quickly in the next few minutes about the key strategic variables that were in place here and some of the things that you can do in your own organization to learn from this.